Switching gears on this one. This woman is Kamala Harris. She's the current vice president of our country. She's also the border czar. Now, that was dubbed by your boss. You see, on March 21st, 2021, President Biden tasked Vice President Kamala Harris with solving the border crisis and finding the root causes of illegal immigration because, as Biden said, she is the most qualified person to do the job. I'd like to make a motion to submit this transcript of Joe Biden's March 24th press conference to the record, Mr. Chairman.
So moved.
It's been 855 days since Joe Biden named Kamala Harris the border czar. Has she solved the root cause of illegal immigration, in your opinion?
Congressman, you have mischaracterized the vice president's role. The vice president is addressing—
No, I have not mischaracterized. Actually, that was the job that was given to her by the President of the United States of America. How did I mischaracterize that?
Congressman, the vice president—
Okay, that's fine. So she has not solved the issue. I think that's actually pretty clear, and I think my colleague Chip Roy did a very good job of articulating that.
Mr. President, over the past few days, we've seen a number of headlines with surprising announcements about the impact the Biden administration's new border policies have had. Reuters, for example, ran a story last week titled, "U.S. Arrests of Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, and Venezuelan Migrants Plummet." The Dallas Morning News had a story titled, "Biden Administration Says Illegal Border Crossings Already Falling Under New Policies." And then the Wall Street Journal ran a story over the weekend with the headline, "Migrant Arrests Fell by Roughly Half in January After New Enforcement Measures." Well, by reading those headlines alone, you might assume that the administration had finally done something it's refused to do over the last 2 years, and that is to take action to address the migration crisis, the humanitarian and public safety crisis that's been occurring at our southern border. You might think that they started using authorities they already had under existing law to enforce those laws at the southern border and deter would-be migrants from making the dangerous journey north. Well, if you made those assumptions, you would be wrong. That's not the case at all. As we know, the border's been operating at a state of crisis for at least the last 2 years. Last year alone, U.S. Customs and Border Protection encountered 2.4 million migrants, completely shattering previous records. And last month, we broke the record for monthly encounters. The agency logged more than 250,000, more than 250,000 border crossings in December alone. Here's the ugly little secret that the Biden administration so far has failed to acknowledge. When Vice President Kamala Harris talks about going to Central America, talks about root causes of the migration crisis, Secretary Blinken talks about root causes, assuming that this is a regional matter affecting Mexico and Central America, and it is primarily people who are coming to the United States strictly for economic reasons or to flee violence. But the fact of the matter is, people are coming from all over the world to our doorstep and seeking asylum. A couple of weeks ago, when we had a bipartisan congressional trip to El Paso, an urban area, and then we went to Yuma, Arizona, which is a sleepy little agricultural community right there along the border of Arizona and California. The acting Border Patrol chief told us that they had people from 176 countries speaking 200 languages seeking asylum coming to the Yuma port of entry. You might ask, how in the world is that possible? That doesn't sound like root causes. That sounds like a global network of human smuggling that's exploiting our asylum laws to gain entry into the United States. Well, Senator Mark Kelly, from Arizona, who was with us, said, well, Mexicali, which is a large city, relatively large city in northern Mexico, just across the border from Yuma, has an airport. And presumably people are flying into Mexicali from disparate places around the world because they know that if they show up at this port of entry in Yuma, they're likely to gain entry to the United States by claiming asylum. And they know because of the backlog in asylum cases that their case is not likely to be heard for literally years. And that if they did ultimately appear in front of an immigration judge, that their chances of successfully gaining asylum, according to the legal standard under American law, was about 10%. And so it doesn't surprise anybody that many of them don't show up for their court hearing, but simply hope to evade detection and be able to permanently settle in the United States. This is what the Border Patrol calls no consequences associated with illegal immigration. And what they've told me and anybody else who will listen is that if there are no consequences to coming to the United States and exploiting our asylum system or illegally coming to the United States, then people are going to keep coming. And indeed, that's what we've seen with an absolute lack of deterrence because of non-enforcement and because of the Biden administration's border policies. So people all over the world are taking advantage of the Biden administration's weak policies. They're crossing their southern border at an alarming rate, imposing huge burdens on the border communities in states like mine, like Texas, that do not have the resources to meet the demands of this crisis. It wasn't that long ago where Del Rio, Texas, small community of 35,000 people, had 15,000 Haitians arrive in their city and claimed asylum. As it turned out, many of those Haitians had been living in South America, having fled Haiti previously, but they'd been living more or less peacefully in South America, but because they saw an opportunity to come to the United States and exploit this same asylum system, that they showed up in Del Rio, Texas, 35,000 people, 15,000 of them, overwhelming the capacity of that small city to deal with them. Until recently, the administration saw two options when it came to migrants. Option one was to use the authorities granted under Title 42 to expel these individuals to Mexico. Of course, Title 42 is a public health title that's been in place because of COVID. Now, option number two was to parole them. Basically, that means to grant them permission to enter into the United States where they would await immigration court proceedings, which, as I said, because of the backlog, because of the sheer volume, will take years. Under the administration's so-called new plan, there's now another option for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. So that's 4 countries. There's a new option for people coming from those 4 countries. It apparently doesn't apply to the other 172 countries that the Yuma Border Patrol chief has said that they have encountered. But under the administration's new plan, there's an option for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans that will allow them to remain in the United States legally for 2 years and receive work authorization. What more of a magnet do you need for people to come to the United States than to give them a work permit and to say that you can stay here legally for 2 years while you await your court proceeding? All they have to do is submit information online before crossing the border and wait for the administration to give them the green light. Well, the Border Patrol, in educating me and others about what's happening at the border, they talk about push factors and they talk about pull factors. And the push factors we all understand. That's poverty, violence, people wanting a better life. We don't begrudge people who want a better life, who want a piece of the American dream, but we should insist that they come to the country through legal means, not illegal means, not exploiting vulnerabilities in our asylum system. But there's no greater pull factor than this idea that there will be no consequences to come to the United States, that you will successfully make your way into the United States, into the interior, and you'll be able to stay. That's the ultimate pull factor. And that's the reason there is zero deterrence under President Biden's open border policies. And apparently he wants to continue that when it comes to people coming from these 4 countries. Well, there's several problems with this plan that I alluded to. First of all, it's not a solution to the open border policies that currently exist. It doesn't discourage migrants from making the long, dangerous journey. It just artificially lowers the numbers. And here's what I mean by that. Before this so-called new policy, if a migrant from one of these 4 countries was apprehended at the border, they would be encountered by the Border Patrol and either removed under Title 42, repatriated, or paroled into the country. Every month, Customs and Border Protection reports the total number of migrants who are released into the United States, giving us an understanding of just how big, what the magnitude of this crisis truly is. Last month, for example, more than 130,000 migrants were paroled into the United States. 130,000, given the paperwork to move into the United States. The administration's taken a lot of heat for the fact that it's engaging in catch and release at an unprecedented pace. Basically, what that means is that rather than being detained while your asylum status is determined, and as I said, the vast majority will not ultimately qualify if they appear in front of an immigration judge, catch and release just makes this worse. Rather than stop the practice and actually detain and remove migrants without legitimate asylum claims, the Biden administration came up with this new policy to, in effect, cook the books. The 30,000 migrants a month who enter the U.S. as part of this new program won't even be included in the monthly statistics that have become a huge political albatross for President Biden. If migrants enter the United States on a legal basis, which is exactly what this program provides, they will never be tallied as part of the migration crisis. They've taken 30,000 people and said, okay, we're going to make your entry into the country legal, so by definition, it's no longer illegal immigration by a wave of the magic wand. In short, this new policy lets the administration roll out the welcome mat for tens of thousands of migrants while making it seem like the numbers have actually gone down, which they have not. Problem number 2 is any progress is all but guaranteed to be temporary. According to the administration, we've seen a 97% drop in the number of illegal crossings for migrants from these 4 countries. And as I said, these are just 4 of the 176 countries represented by the folks who show up at the one Yuma Border Patrol crossing currently. So it's just 4 countries. It appears now that there are thousands of migrants who would have previously arrived at the border who are now waiting for the Biden administration to approve their online application. But what happens after those 30,000 spots are filled? What happens when it takes months rather than weeks for migrants to receive the green light? I can tell you exactly what will happen. Migrants from these 4 countries will start coming across the border illegally once again. Will they be expelled under Title 42? Will they be paroled into the interior? Only time will tell. But one thing is for sure, once the line gets too long, we'll be right back where we started, only with an added challenge. There will be a new population of tens of or even hundreds of thousands of people living and working in the United States on what is supposed to be a temporary basis. As Ronald Reagan once noted, he said, "There's nothing so permanent as a temporary government program." Third, the new program normalizes migrants coming to the United States based on facts that would not qualify them under our current laws for asylum. The administration's description of urgent humanitarian reasons that would qualify a Haitian migrant for the program, for example, points to gang violence, the aftermath of an earthquake, or a cholera breakout that worsen political, economic, or social conditions. Now, we can all agree these are terrible conditions, but they don't meet the standard for a valid asylum claim. That leads to perhaps the biggest problem of all, that the administration circumvented, did an end run around Congress to implement this policy, which has basically teed up an even bigger headache. President Biden is following the footsteps of President Obama by creating a new category of immigrants without consulting with or getting the agreement of Congress. As we saw with President Obama and the Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals, his use of executive action 10 years ago has now created more problems for this population of young people who came here as children and who are now adults, because the courts have so far said that President Obama didn't have the authority to do what he purported to do. By the way, you go back and do an internet search and see what President Obama said shortly before he granted this deferred action to childhood arrivals. I think he said perhaps as many as 17 times, I could be off a little bit, that he did not have the authority. He said he did not have the authority to do what he ultimately did. And unfortunately, now the courts are agreeing with him, putting the livelihood and future of these young people in jeopardy. It's been more than a decade since DACA was established, and the fate of these young people are still being litigated in court. It's a terrible circumstance to find themselves in, and this won't be any different. The Biden policies will allow migrants to live and work in the United States for 2 years, and then what? Well, will they leave voluntarily? I doubt it. Will they be apprehended and removed by Immigration and Customs Enforcement? No, I doubt that. Or will this be another group of migrants who will live in the shadows? There's no question our immigration system is broken. I have yet to find a person, a responsible person, who thinks our immigration system is working the way it should. It's big, it's outdated, it's inefficient, and it's not serving our nation's interests well. But if the president wants to undertake immigration reform, as he says he does, this is not the way to go. By end-running Congress to try to establish new categories of immigrants, he's poisoning the well. He's making it harder for us to do what many of us would like to do, and that is to take on the monumental task of securing the border and creating a legal immigration system that serves our nation's interests and one that we can be proud of. But by poisoning the well, the president's not gaining new allies. He's just ensuring that more people will resist any potential legislation that we might take up soon. So despite what the initial data may suggest and what the spin doctors here in Washington have been selling to the news media, which has gullibly been accepting that as if this is somehow a big deal or a negative trend in terms of illegal immigration, it's not so. The president hasn't solved the problem. He's just swept it under the rug, and he's arguably made it worse. This crisis is complex, but the solution isn't. The administration needs to engage with Congress and enforce our immigration laws that are on the books, and those that are being exploited by the international criminal networks that are smuggling people into the United States on a daily basis. We need to work together to address those gaps that are being exploited. If migrants from any country see the U.S. as quickly detaining and removing people who do not have legal basis to remain in our country, the flow of illegal immigration will drop dramatically. That's the only viable path forward and where the administration should focus its time and effort. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, in January, monthly border crossings dropped below 200,000 for the first time since last March. Last month, U.S. Customs and Border Protection logged more than 156,000 illegal border crossings. This is the busiest January in more than 2 decades. Yet somehow, the Biden administration is trying to claim victory for this temporary dip in illegal border crossings. If you ask me, the president's popping the cork a little early. For starters, these numbers are artificially reduced thanks to the administration's new parole program. Now, parole is not a commonly used word, but what the parole does in this context is it allows up to 30,000 people from specific countries per month into the United States. Basically, they're waived on through. If migrants enter the country on a legal basis, which is exactly what this program creates, they'll never be tallied as part of the illegal migration statistics. So how better to make something illegal legal than to simply wave your magic wand and create a new category by which migrants are admitted to the United States. In short, this new policy has allowed the administration to roll out the welcome mat for tens of thousands of migrants while pretending that the humanitarian and public safety crisis at the border is abating. It's not. It's not abating. Second, January is a historically slow month for migration. During the previous administration, Customs and Border Protection logged an average of about 43,000 illegal border crossings each January. As a reminder, last month we encountered 156,000. 43,000 during the previous administration, this administration 156,000 in January. Now, as we head into spring, those numbers are sure to climb again. Warming temperatures and seasonal work always leads to increased migration, and I don't expect this year to be an exception. The numbers may have dropped temporarily last month, but there's no reason for the president to spike the football or to claim victory. Every single day, thousands of migrants cross the United States-Mexico border. The overwhelming majority arrive here with only what they can carry on their backs. When they reach the United States, they need food, shelter, clothing, medical care, transportation, and the like. Since President Biden took office, the pace of illegal border crossings has made this already tough job of caring for migrants increasingly more challenging, just by the sheer volume of humanity coming across the border. So law enforcement, nonprofits, folks in my state who live and work on the border have begged the Biden administration to take action. It's not even fair to say that they were met with a shrug. Rather, they were just ignored. In order to ease the burden on border communities in Texas, Governor Greg Abbott began transporting migrants to other states and cities last year. If the Biden administration is going to give them a piece of paper and say, show up for an immigration court hearing at some indefinite date in the future, perhaps years in the future, then Governor Abbott's theory was, rather than have them wait there in the border communities, give them a bus ticket and let them go to the place where they have told the U.S. government they intended to relocate pending their court hearing. But the moment the challenges spread from these small border towns in Texas to liberal enclaves in the Northeast, the outrage machine fired up big time. Now, President Biden didn't care about the border crisis when it affected the Rio Grande Valley or Laredo or Del Rio or El Paso, but the moment it reached Manhattan and Martha's Vineyard or Chicago or Washington, D.C., it was somehow a crisis. And, of course, we know who the president blamed. He blamed Republicans. Forget the fact that nonprofits have a long-standing practice of using federal funds to transport migrants all over the country to await their future court hearing. But once the state of Texas or the state of Arizona or the state of Florida began offering transportation to these same migrants, the president and our Democratic colleagues had an absolute meltdown. Our colleague from Illinois, Senator Durbin, called the practice cruel and inhumane. The White House press secretary said it was shameful and reckless. And Vice President Kamala Harris went so far as to call this the height of irresponsibility and the dereliction of duty. So when it hurts my constituents, my border communities, the people I represent here in the Senate, they're simply ignored. But once that problem begins to show up on the doorstep of the vice president or Mayor Bowser or Mayor Adams or the mayor of Chicago, you'd think the roof was falling in. Well, I don't think Vice President Harris recognized the many layers of irony in the statement that somehow this was a dereliction of duty and a height of irresponsibility. What it shows is simply how little she understands the nature of the problem, much less any way to try to fix it. Now it's not just the nonprofits and the Republican governors who are transporting migrants, it's the Democratic mayor of New York City. Eric Adams is the mayor of the largest city in the United States. New York City is home to roughly 8.5 million people, and its annual budget exceeds $100 billion. That's higher than all but a handful of states. Once busloads of migrants began to arrive in New York City last year, Mayor Adams quickly realized what border mayors have been saying all along, that this is a big problem. After welcoming a few thousand migrants, Mayor Adams said his city was near the breaking point. Again, this was a reaction when a few thousand migrants arrived in a major city with a $100 billion annual budget. Can you imagine what it's been like in small towns like Del Rio, Texas, of 35,000 people, where they had 15,000 Haitians under a bridge in that small city, and frankly, without the resources to deal with them. So, frankly, I'm not all that sympathetic of Mayor Adams' quandary because of what my constituents have been living with for the entirety of the Biden administration. New York City has vast resources and a long list of folks willing to help, and still it was struggling to care for the migrants arriving on its doorstep. Meanwhile, communities across Texas, small in comparison to New York, were absorbing thousands of migrants in a single day with only a fraction of the resources. Over the last several months, the number of migrants arriving in New York City has grown dramatically. It's received more than 40,000 migrants, and the challenges have only grown. I'm not surprised by that, but this is a taste of what we've been experiencing for years, thanks to the Biden administration's dereliction of duty. Mayor Adams started doing what Republican governors of Texas and the Democratic mayor of El Paso had already done. He offered these migrants free transportation elsewhere. So they come to New York City. Mayor Adams said, "This is terrible." And what does he do? But then offer the migrants a free bus ticket to go somewhere else. New York City has purchased bus tickets for migrants heading in all directions around the country. Migrants were offered a free ride, and many willingly accepted. This is exactly what's happened in border states like Texas, but the reaction's been completely different. I haven't heard Vice President Harris, for example, call this the height of irresponsibility or dereliction of duty. Certainly, our Democratic colleagues haven't repeated their claims that this is somehow cruel and inhumane, no matter how erroneous they were in the first place. When migrants receive free bus tickets from conservative states like Texas, it's framed as a human rights abuse. But when it happens in Manhattan, it's viewed as an act of charity or kindness. The hypocrisy is simply breathtaking. Now, to be clear, I don't fault Mayor Adams for helping migrants reach other parts of the country. I'm sure he's trying to manage with this new phenomenon, but I would hope that he would recognize that this has been something we've been having to cope with as a result of the failure of the federal government to deal with this humanitarian and public safety crisis. The influx of tens of thousands of migrants can certainly place a strain on local health systems and emergency response services. It can put a dent in a city's budget. It can overwhelm the nonprofits and hurt the vulnerable locals who already rely on those services. But that is exactly what we've been seeing in states like mine for years, but to no avail. It's unfair to expect any city, any state, to carry the burden of this crisis because it is the federal government's responsibility. We now learn that every community in America is now a border community. This morning during a Finance Committee hearing, the chairman of the Finance Committee, the senator from Oregon, Senator Wyden, and the ranking member from Idaho, Senator Crapo, both were recounting about the influx of fentanyl and synthetic opioids into their states and the impact it's having on crime and overdose deaths of the people they represent and care so much about. But last year alone, 108,000 Americans died of drug overdoses, 71,000 of those from synthetic opioids. Virtually all of that 108,000, those 108,000 deaths were caused by drugs that came across the southern border. So it's not just economic migrants looking for a job and a better way of life. It's people with criminal records, sex offenders. It's people smuggling drugs into the United States. It's the criminal gangs that distribute those drugs in major cities all across the country, including in New Jersey, and who are responsible for much of the violence, particularly the gun violence, as they fight for market share and territory. So every community in the country now is a border community and a border state. Well, this is not what successful immigration or border security policy looks like. The number of border crossings may have temporarily dipped, but communities across the country are still being crushed by the weight of President Biden's border crisis. The one silver lining in all this is that it appears the president is finally acknowledging the crisis at the border. With a possible re-election for president just around the corner, it looks like he's finally giving at least lip service to this major political liability. In his State of the Union address last week, President Biden urged members of Congress to, I quote, he said, "If you won't pass my comprehensive immigration reform bill, at least pass my plan to provide the equipment and officers to secure the border," close quote. Well, I was wondering what plan the president was referring to. None of us have seen it, to my knowledge. I've asked many of my Senate colleagues, and they don't know what the president's even talking about, because none of them have seen his plan to secure the border. He hasn't shown a serious interest in using the existing authorities to stop the flow of illegal immigration. But if the president's views have changed and now he's serious about dealing with this crisis, he will find a lot of allies here in Congress, and I would be one of them. Senators on this side of the aisle want to reform the processes by which migrants are handled to quickly remove unlawful migrants who have invalid asylum claims and ensure that the cartels are not able to overwhelm the Border Patrol by directing migrants to key strategic locations, while then the drug cartels move illegal drugs into the country that take the lives of innocent Americans. The experts I listened to, the Border Patrol mainly, have advocated for a combination of personnel, technology, and infrastructure to ensure that the Border Patrol is capable of stopping dangerous criminals and contraband at the border. And we need to fix the broken asylum system, along with its characteristic catch and release. Because if there are no real consequences for people coming into the country, even though they don't qualify for asylum, they're going to continue to come. And that's been the case during the entirety of the Biden administration. So if the president is serious now at long last, I encourage him to pick up the phone. Communities across Texas and across the country are suffering because of the Biden administration's failure to simply do the job of the federal government. As Mayor Adams said while visiting El Paso last month, he said, "Our cities are being undermined, and we don't deserve this. Migrants don't deserve this, and the people who live in the cities don't deserve this." I agree with Mayor Adams, and I hope President Biden has finally learned that lesson as well. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
But I want to say I'm really proud of our district because even if we don't disagree with someone, we still do not treat them that way. Because that's not the kind of people we are. You know, recently Kamala Harris came into town. Did y'all see her? And there were people that did show up and protest, and God bless you for that. But their protest was not anything like the protest that I was greeted with in New York. And I am very proud and thankful for that. They made signs. Their signs were not inappropriate. Their signs were good and their message was good. It didn't have cuss words or horrible sayings. No one hurled insults at Kamala Harris. No one called her nasty four-letter names and all kinds of names I can't say and won't say on this stage. But they did protest her, and they have the right to do that. But I'm really proud of our values here and the values that we display when we're in front of the press or we're pictured, because we display it correctly. We can disagree with people, but we can still do it and represent ourselves in a very classy way. And I'm very proud of this district for that. And I also want to say I thought it was pretty funny that Vice President Kamala Harris decided to come on down to Dalton, Georgia to try to take credit for Q cells and their solar panels simply because the federal government had purchased a bunch of their solar panels. You see, when you talk to Q cells and you read all of their statements, they weren't thanking the Biden administration, and especially Kamala Harris, because she doesn't do anything at all. Right. They were thanking the local county and the local state officials that helped them open their business, not the Biden administration. But you see, that's how the Biden administration works. They take credit for things they didn't do.
Absolutely.
And to be honest with you, they're not doing anything good in Washington. They're mostly destroying our country.
Absolutely. Amen.
Yes.
President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I'd ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, on Monday, President Biden's Department of Justice filed suit against my state, Texas, over our efforts to secure our border. Of the 2,000-mile southern border, Texas has a 1,200-mile border with Mexico. And of course, that's been the epicenter of the humanitarian and public safety crisis that we've seen get nothing but worse over the last 2 years. It's almost laughable if it wasn't so serious. The administration filed suit over what it called humanitarian concerns, which is more than a little ironic. This is the same administration whose policies have ushered in an unprecedented humanitarian and public security crisis at the southern border. I've talked previously about the 300,000 children, unaccompanied children, who've been placed with sponsors in the interior of the United States by the Biden administration during the last 2.5 years, and the fact that the administration has lost track of at least 85,000 of those 300,000 children. When they were contacted or attempted to be contacted by the Office of Refugee Relocation and Health and Human Services, 30 days after they were placed with a sponsor, there was no answer and no follow-up by the administration. This is the same administration that turned a blind eye when countless young migrants were being exploited on American soil. The New York Times has run 2 investigative pieces pointing out that essentially the administration doesn't know where any of these 300,000 unaccompanied children are, whether they're going to school, whether they're getting their health care attended to, whether they're being recruited into gangs or sexually abused or otherwise neglected. They don't know, and apparently they don't care, because if they did care, then they would take the effort to find out and do something about it. Vice President Harris was designated as the administration's border czar during this unprecedented crisis, which has taken a devastating toll on migrants and law enforcement, border communities, and it's affected every city in the country, from New York to Washington, D.C., to Chicago. Every state, in a sense, has been affected by the border crisis and has become a border state in that sense. Vice President Harris, despite her effort to do anything to address this crisis at the border, she has had the audacity to criticize Governor Abbott's actions as, quote, inhumane, outrageous, and un-American. Of course, she can't be bothered to actually go to the border and find out what's happening there on her own. You know, there's a lot of misconceptions about the border. People who haven't been there haven't learned from themselves, from the experts, the Border Patrol, the non-governmental organizations that do their best to try to take care of these people. Vice President Harris simply hasn't bothered to learn, yet she has the audacity to criticize Governor Abbott for doing what he has to do because of the failure of the Biden administration to do its job. The unavoidable reality is we wouldn't be in this situation if it weren't for President Biden abdicating his responsibilities. This is an international border, as we all know. That, by definition, is the federal government's responsibility. But the Biden administration has simply, as I said, abdicated its responsibilities with tragic consequences. Unlike President Biden, Governor Abbott took action. His constituents, my constituents, 30 million Texans, insisted upon it. And he put measures in place to try to deter migrants from attempting the dangerous journey from their home across the border into the United States. We know, particularly now with temperatures in the triple digits, that migrants face a brutal environment, heat, dangerous waters, treacherous terrain, and sadly, many migrants do not survive the journey. Does President Biden understand that last year alone, at least 748 people died making their way across the southern border? I know he's never been to Brooks County, which is the location of one of the interior checkpoints where the coyotes will drive people up from the stash houses along the border, short of the checkpoint, tell the migrants, get out of the vehicle, and here's a gallon jug of water and maybe a candy bar and meet me on the top side, on the north side of the border checkpoint in order to evade the interior checkpoints. Well, Brooks County had so many migrants who died under those circumstances, making that trek around the checkpoint, they didn't have the money to actually bury the bodies. And so we actually had to try to provide some additional resources to help them do that. Again, the hypocrisy of the Biden administration complaining about the state trying to do its best to deal with a vacuum when it comes to federal responsibility is absolutely ridiculous. So 748 people we know died at trying to come across the southern border, and they're complaining about efforts to try to deter or dissuade people from making that dangerous trip in the first place. That's what the Governor Abbott's trying to do, and being criticized by the very people who are not doing their job. If the president is unhappy with the actions Texas has taken, there is a clear solution. Do your job. If the president and his administration did their job, there'd be no need for the state to use its resources and its tax dollars to do the job that the federal government should be doing. Until then, Governor Abbott has every right to use the powers available to him to keep our state safe, to protect our citizens. That's his right as an elected head of a sovereign state. I want to make a point of thanking all the countless federal, state, and local law enforcement officers, as well as the National Guardsmen from Texas, the Department of Public Safety, and others who have been deployed to the border for their tireless work to protect our state and our country. They deserve our commendation and our appreciation, not criticism, particularly when it's so misguided and unfair. The Biden administration may not appreciate the efforts of the state of Texas, but the vast majority of us see, understand, and are grateful for everything Texas guards, local law enforcement, DPS, and others are doing to keep our country safe. Mr. President, on another matter, the Senate is in the process of fulfilling one of its most important responsibilities, and that is protecting the safety and security of our nation by advancing the National Defense Authorization Act. I want to commend Senators Reid and Senators Wicker, the chairman and ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, for their leadership on this bill and for maintaining a bipartisan process which has historically guided this legislation. Congress has managed to overcome partisan differences to pass a defense authorization bill for each of the past 62 years. That's quite an accomplishment, and I hope we can build on that record of success again this year. Our colleagues on the Armed Services Committee compiled a strong bill, and I'm glad the Senate now has an opportunity to try to improve it further by offering and voting on various amendments. Yesterday evening, the Senate adopted a bipartisan amendment I introduced with Senator Casey, the senator from Ohio, to strengthen our ability to counter threats from China. It does this by providing greater visibility into certain investments American entities are making in China and other countries of concern. Our amendment received overwhelming bipartisan support. It passed by a vote of 91-6, which is incredibly rare these days. I want to express my gratitude to Senator Casey and all of our colleagues who worked together, particularly on the Banking Committee and others. Thank them for supporting this amendment and working with us to overcome this initial hurdle. We know when this bill goes to conference with the House of Representatives, there'll be other discussions about this topic, but it's important that we have a strong vote on this outbound investment transparency provision, because we need to know what American companies are doing to help grow the economy of our chief competitor on the planet, which is using that strong economy, by the way, to arm itself and threaten its neighbors in the region. We need to know, and this legislation will allow us to know exactly what's going on so we can consider whether other policy provisions are necessary. We know the House passed its own version of the NDAA last month, but it didn't include any provisions on this outbound investment issue. So I'm confident in the coming weeks, members of the House and the Senate will need to iron out the differences between our two versions, and it's absolutely critical that this outbound investment transparency that the Senate so enthusiastically supported be part of that final conference report. We all know the Chinese Communist Party has become increasingly aggressive in its efforts to gain power and influence through intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers, predatory lending practices like the Belt and Road Initiative. China has grown its economic power and is using these same methods to pursue global military dominance. In China, there's no bright line separating the military and civilian sectors. This is part of an intentional strategy known as military-civil fusion, which promotes the development of dual-use technology. In other words, can be used in the private sector and can be used by the People's Liberation Army. In short, the Chinese Communist Party is investing its technologies that bolster both its military strength and its economic power. And unfortunately, many American entities are fueling the success of China's military-civil fusion, maybe even without knowing really what they are doing. In testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee, an unusual open hearing, I heard some concerning figures that illustrate just how big this problem is. At the end of 2020, U.S. investments in Chinese companies had a total market value of $2.3 trillion. That's foreign investments from the United States into the People's Republic of China worth $2.3 trillion in 2020. That included $21 billion in semiconductors, $54 billion to Chinese military companies, and a whopping $221 billion in artificial intelligence. There's been a lot of discussion here in the Senate and in Washington, D.C. about what's the future of artificial intelligence. Well, American companies have been investing a lot of money in China and helping them develop their artificial intelligence capabilities. And we know this authoritarian country, under the leadership of President Xi, does not have benign intentions. We need to be very careful about exactly how much and in what sectors the American business community is investing in China when they are our number one global competitor. Intentionally or not, American companies are bankrolling the Chinese Communist Party's military rise. They're pouring huge amounts of capital into capabilities that could be used against the United States and certainly against our allies. These few data points are deeply concerning, but the truth is, these are just a few pieces of the puzzle. We can't see the full picture, but we need to. Currently, there are no requirements for companies to report billion-dollar investments in Chinese companies. The full extent of U.S. investments could be much larger and more concerning, but we simply don't have the information. That's exactly why Senator Casey and I offered this amendment and why the Senate adopted it so overwhelmingly, 91-6. The strong bipartisan support for this amendment is evidence that this bill strengthens our national security without impacting the free market. We're not interested in decoupling from China, as some people have advocated. And I think Secretary Blinken and Secretary Yellen, who've used the word de-risking, is an appropriate use of that term. We're trying to de-risk our economies in our two countries. So hopefully it will never come to any open conflict. We want to make sure that we are strong enough to deter China from ever even thinking about invading Taiwan, for example. But as our colleagues know, the requirement of reporting or providing notice of U.S.-based investments in China, it does not apply to every investment under the sun, the one that we just voted on. It's a highly targeted amendment and only applies to sensitive technologies like semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and hypersonics. These are the technologies and capabilities that pose the greatest national security risk to the United States of America. And to be clear, it does not stop investments from happening or interfere with other investments by American companies in the People's Republic of China. It simply requires companies or other entities to share information about investments in certain technologies. This is all about transparency. It will help the United States see and understand the threats from China and other countries are concerned so we can act accordingly. Some of our colleagues had said, well, we need to do more. I agree. But I think this is an important first step. And certainly this, when we say politics is the art of the possible, this is what's possible now, and I would hope with additional information that's generated from these transparency measures, we can make a decision at some later point whether different policies need to be applied. But for now, this represents an important first step. The reality is, things like sanctions to restrictions to outright ban on investments don't have the political support on both sides of the aisle in both chambers that they need in order to become law. So rather than adopt an all or nothing approach, which will end up leaving us with nothing, we decided to again engage in the art of the possible, and this amendment demonstrates that that is achievable. The outbound investment provision promotes our national security. It protects the free market, and it provides much greater visibility into the threats posed by our most formidable potential adversaries. Outbound investment transparency is absolutely crucial to our ability to understand what is happening in China and to counter any threats. I urge my colleagues in the Senate and the House as well to fight to preserve this language during the conference process. But in closing, let me just again thank Chairman Reid and Ranking Member Wicker and all of our colleagues on the Armed Services Committee for all the work that's gone into this bill so far. I know we're not through. We're going to have a number of votes today and tomorrow, but they provided us a strong foundation and a strong base to build on. And I'm glad those of us who are not on the Armed Services Committee have a chance to offer our suggestions and improve the bill by the amendment process. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor. And I'd note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, this week, the Vice President traveled to North Carolina to tout the Biden administration's so-called accomplishments in helping our nation's small business. Well, the American people can see through the Vice President's PR stunt and know sky-high inflation, worker shortage, and supply chain disruptions are nothing to celebrate. I have been a small business owner for 52 years and still am, and know these economic headwinds job creators are facing firsthand. The reality is small businesses are worse off due to this administration's disastrous policies and out-of-control Washington spending. As the chairman of the Small Business Committee, I welcome anyone who wants to celebrate entrepreneurship and recognize our great small businesses. However, no amount of media events will change the dire reality Main Street continues to experience under this administration's 2-year crackdown on job creators. More needs to be done to unleash the full potential of Main Street, and the direction must change before anyone goes on a victory lap or asks for a trophy. In God we trust. I yield back.
You talk a lot about policy, and some of that policy, like Remain in Mexico, probably not going to fly with the Biden administration. But have you had any conversations with either Democrats or the administration about policies that you could compromise on to make this a little bit easier?
Democrats can't look and hear these stories without realizing what a disaster this administration has brought onto this country. They know it, specifically the Democrats from border states, but others that looked at this situation. And now, when did the president start paying any attention to this? When the mayors of New York and Chicago said it is destroying their cities. And the numbers there are very small compared to this 8 million. So the attention has to be to stop the problem, to stop the inflow, where the president is looking for money to give it to sanctuary cities so they can build housing. The president wants money to go for a welcome wagon. We're going to completely oppose all of those sorts of things. So we're always looking for solutions. The solutions that we have are actually to a major problem that the president has brought on. And I'm not in any way interested in funding sanctuary cities.
When we were down there, we asked the Border Patrol agents, we said, how many Democrats come down to do this? And they laughed. They said, oh, Democrats don't do this. A couple of Democrats have been to the border. They don't go on midnight patrols. They don't go actually encounter the illegal immigrants. We now know Joe Biden went to the border once. He went to El Paso. And he instructed his advance team, clean all the illegal immigrants out. He said, according to the White House, said he did not encounter a single illegal immigrant when he was there. He only went to a bridge, he met with government officials, and he left. That's deliberate. Look, you can't see what's happening and defend it. The last time we were down there, I had a reporter ask me, said, well, aren't the Democrat policies on immigration much more humane and compassionate? I just started laughing. I said, you know who doesn't believe that anymore? The Democrats. Where's Joe Biden? Where's Kamala Harris? Where's a Democrat senator? Where's Chuck Schumer? If this was humane and compassionate, they'd be holding press conferences down at the border. Look how humane and compassionate we are. You can no longer see the human suffering. We had the sheriff of Brooks County bring a binder just with photographs of dead bodies that he finds day after day after day of migrants who died crossing into this country. You can't defend the Biden body bags anymore. So the entire Democrat approach is hide from it, and they're frankly counting on the media. They're counting on the media not to tell the American people what's happening because they have no defense. You know, you asked a minute ago about the supplemental. Understand the White House's strategy here because it's an utter joke. The funding that they call, quote, border security is not designed to reduce even one illegal immigrant. It's not designed to stop even 1 pound of fentanyl. What it is designed to do is accelerate this process. The Biden administration is asking for more money to process illegal immigrants faster. More planes and more buses to send more illegal immigrants to New York City and Washington, D.C. and Chicago and every city in America. They don't want to stop it. And understand, Joe Biden could prevent this tomorrow. When you ask the Border Patrol agents, how do we fix this? They say, look, we don't need more money. We need policy. And here's the policy we need. When we catch someone, follow the law and deport them. And if you do that, the numbers plummet. Right now, when they catch someone, they let them go. And that person gets on their phone, gets on social media, tells all their friends back home, hey, if you come here, you get to stay. That question, it's one question. What happens when someone's apprehended? Do they get sent home or do they stay here? As long as Joe Biden insists the answer is they stay here, that number will keep going up. Children will keep being sexually abused. women will continue to be raped, and people will continue to die of fentanyl drug overdoses. The Democrats can't defend that. That's why they don't go, because they can't answer these questions, and they bear responsibility. You know, the Border Patrol agents, we were asking the kids these questions. One of the things they said to me is they said, you know, the agents have stopped asking because they have families. They go home to their kids, and they can't stand the fact that they were just with a bunch of kids who were violently raped by human traffickers. That's happening today. It happened yesterday. It happened the day before. And it will continue happening as long as Joe Biden and the Senate Democrats want it to happen. And it's utterly indefensible.
Three of us have these. We have this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment prohibits any funding from being used by the Office of the Vice President for salaries and other expenses. Kamala Harris has been a failure as Vice President. From her inability to manage her team effectively, leading to high turnover, to her disastrous job as border czar, where she has failed to secure anything. I mean, let's look at the numbers. Since the Biden-Harris administration took office, there have been over 6.2 million illegal crossings of our southern border. In September alone, there were 269,735 illegal immigrants encountered at the southern border. That is an increase of over 300% since September of 2020. Customs and Border Protection has seized over 27,000 pounds of fentanyl just in fiscal year 23. 169 people whose names were on the terrorist list were stopped trying to cross the border. Cartels are making more than $13 billion a year from smuggling people across our border. The Biden-Harris far-left border policies are to blame for this crisis. And what has this border czar done about it? Nothing. The only thing our Vice President has succeeded at is failing us in our reserve.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves. Mr. Gentleman from Maryland, seek recognition.
I rise in opposition, and I hope the chairman will be in opposition to this amendment.
The chairman is, the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. There are a lot of vice presidents I haven't agreed with. I would have never contemplated offering, Mr. Chairman, an amendment to strike their ability to carry out the duties to which they were elected by the American people, any more than I would suggest a member of Congress that doesn't perform very well or very efficiently or very effectively have their offices defunded. They were elected by the people, and they're entitled to the resources to carry out those duties and responsibility given to the American people. I hope this amendment is overwhelmingly rejected. I yield back. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. I think that the facts speak for themselves on our border czar, and I reserve.
Rosendale of Montana.
Pursuant to House Resolution 847, the gentleman from Montana, Mr. Rosendale, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Montana, Mr. Rosendale.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my amendment number 92 would prohibit funding for President Biden's new Office of Gun Violence Prevention. Since President Biden took office in January 21, our Second Amendment rights have been under an assault. And now, with the stroke of a pen, President Biden created the Office of Gun Violence Prevention, allowing his administration to bypass Congress unilaterally and implement the left's gun control agenda. This office would be overseen by Vice President Kamala Harris and staffed with radical former gun control lobbyists, allowing the swamp to have total control of the Biden's gun control agenda. In Montana, 64% of the households have firearms, and Montanans will not go along with the White House attempt to undermine our Second Amendment rights. People often say, what are they afraid of out there in Montana? Why do they need so many firearms? I will tell you, we're not afraid of anything. And it's because we do have our firearms. It's unacceptable for the hard-earned tax dollars of gun owners in Montana to fund the salaries of unelected, gun-grabbing bureaucrats who are hell-bent on branding law-abiding, responsible gun owners as criminals. My amendment would throw a wrench in the gun control lobbyist plans and severely hamper the Biden administration's ability to impose further restrictions on our Second Amendment rights. It's time we drain the swamp and kick the gun control lobby out of the White House. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. For what purposes the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, I rise in opposition to this senseless amendment. The White House Gun Violence Task Force is committed to treating gun violence as the public health crisis it is. By approaching this issue from a public health perspective, the task force aims to reduce the staggering number of deaths and injuries caused by firearms in the United States. The task force emphasizes the importance of data-driven and evidence-based policy decisions that will create solutions that balance the rights of law-abiding gun owners with the need for public safety. Mr. Chair, as a gun owner myself, I tell you that task force seeks to enact common sense gun safety measures that the majority of Americans support. These include background checks for all gun sales, closing the gun show and online sale loopholes, and implementing red flag laws temporarily to disarm individuals who pose a danger to themselves or others. I strongly oppose this amendment, and I do urge a no vote. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Montana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I've referenced, VP Harris possesses no special credentials to run the Office of Gun Violence Prevention and will act as nothing more than a figurehead. The office will rely on left-wing special interests and lobbyists to enact the Democrats' war on the Second Amendment while also rewarding President Biden's donors with cushy jobs at the White House. Rob Wilcox, the Deputy Director of the Office of Gun Violence Prevention, led federal policy at Everytown for Gun Safety, which is primarily financed by Michael Bloomberg. All the time that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are trying to undermine and compromise our Second Amendment rights, they fail to recognize the prosecutors that they have put in place around the country that refuse to charge and prosecute the criminals that should not have guns, that have been doing crimes with illegal firearms. That's where the focus needs to be. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Chair, at this time I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Florida, Mr. Frost.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong opposition to this amendment to eliminate the White House Office on Gun Violence Prevention, which President Biden took historic action to create. This year, there have been more shootings than days in the year. It's been a deadly year, and that's why the American people want to see us take action, not tear down the simple efforts they're owed. But my colleagues aren't listening to the American people. They're listening to the gun lobby. They're listening to the gun manufacturers. The gun lobby that emailed everyone about this amendment that we're debating right now, saying they endorse against any politician who votes with common sense. An email filled with pure hyperbole saying that this office was made to take guns away. This office is not created to take guns away. It's created to save lives. The American people fear for their safety. It should be more important than Republican politicians' fear for their careers. How many more dreams need to be extinguished until we say enough is enough? And the swamp/radicals that we're referring to are people like Greg Jackson, a survivor of gun violence who was shot not too far from this chamber and fought for his life in the hospital, almost died due to senseless gun violence, and has committed his life to saving all of our lives. I'm offended that someone would call him or Rob Wilcox, another survivor of gun violence, the swamp. The White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention will save lives, and voting no means trying to eliminate a FEMA-like response for communities after shootings and the coordination of gun violence prevention programs that will save lives. I urge my colleagues to vote no.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Montana is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Again, what my colleagues fail to recognize time and time again is the fact that we have so much crime that takes place, criminal on criminal, or criminals committing these crimes, and a crossfire, an innocent victim gets tied up in it. And they also refuse to recognize that these communities and cities that are led by Democrat leaders have had increased crime rates over the last several years since the Biden administration has taken over. And that is because they have prosecutors that are not charging and prosecuting these criminals and letting them off without proper punitive measures taking place. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to Mr. Frost of Florida.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
My colleagues on the other side of the aisle will make this about criminal on criminal activity. This office, one of the core tenets of the office, is for community violence intervention. One of the only such programs in our country that go into communities, find out people who are most likely to shoot someone and people who are most likely to be shot, create relationships and intervene before the violence happens. So this office is working to solve exactly the problem that you just iterated. And so I hope if you'll follow your own logic, if my colleagues follow their own logic, that they'll vote no on this amendment so we can save lives across the entire country. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves.
We oppose the amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Montana is recognized for 1.5 minutes left.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would just like to finish up by saying, forgive me if I don't trust a federal agency to be policing a community and using their discretion about who may or may not be committing a crime in the future. My gosh, we have just witnessed the FBI conducting surveillance on Catholics because they were attending Latin masses. We watched them conduct surveillance on parents because they dared attempt to attend school board meetings. And now we are going to unleash the federal agencies to conduct surveillance on people who might own a firearm, who may not own a firearm, who might commit a crime in the future, and they are going to be the sole judge of that. The people across Montana will not support that. They will not tolerate that. And this amendment deems to get rid of an agency that's trying to do those exact kind of acts. I ask my colleagues to please support this amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Montana. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Chair, I demand a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Montana will be postponed. It is now in order to consider.
Thank you for that time, I think. Good morning, and good to see all of you. You know, when we ran for the majority, we made a commitment to America. We talked about a number of things that we would do. We've already gotten hard at work on those things. One of the things we committed is that we would bring Congress to the people. We'd actually have field hearings in communities across America to listen to real citizens, listen to people in their communities talking about the challenges that people are facing so that we can do a better job up here of bringing legislation that responds to the problems that they're dealing with. As we all know, there is a crisis at our southern border. While the vice president, who is supposed to be the czar of the border, will not go down to the border, we've gone down multiple times. And just these last 2 weeks, we had a number of committees holding hearings at the border. You saw the Energy and Commerce Committee, the Judiciary Committee, the Homeland Security Committee, all holding hearings. In fact, not only did they talk about the crisis at the border, Catherine McMorris Rodgers in the Energy and Commerce Committee had a hearing specifically on the fentanyl crisis. You know, today, almost 300 young people will die from fentanyl overdoses. Yesterday, nearly 300 died. Tomorrow, nearly 300 young people will die every single day in America because Joe Biden opened the border. We've been highlighting this for a long time, and it angers a lot of people. We've heard from families at these hearings. I think it's disgraceful that a majority of Democrats refuse to even show up at these hearings. These are full committee hearings, Republican, Democrat, where citizens are coming, law enforcement officers are coming in their communities talking about the problems that Washington can fix. President Biden could fix these problems today, and he refuses to. And so Congress is working through the legislative process to bring bills to the floor to confront these problems. And it starts with hearings, and especially these hearings in communities across America. So we're going to continue doing this to get that feedback from people who are struggling because of the weight of the problems coming out of Washington, so that we can have Washington better respond to those hardworking families. If Democrats want to be a part of that, we've invited them and welcomed them to be a part. If they want to sit on the sidelines and let these families struggle without even showing up for work, we're going to show up for work, and we're going to bring those bills. This week we've got a few more of those bills. One, of course, dealing with ESG, which is hurting a lot of investors, people who have 401ks, who have pension funds. But we're also bringing, as our conference chair talked about, Elise Stefanik's bill, the Rein in Inflation Act. Inflation is probably the biggest challenge facing hardworking taxpayers. They're paying more for everything. Double-digit increases at the grocery store, double-digit increases on their energy bills. And President Biden and all of his far-left radical rules and regulations that are coming out of these agencies are crushing hardworking families. And shouldn't they at least put the cost? When they roll out a new rule or regulation or executive order, shouldn't you at least see the cost to families, so that maybe they think twice before imposing these costs on families? The average family is losing about $10,000 a year in higher costs because of all these radical rules coming out of Washington. It's about time we start reining that in. We're going to be bringing a bill to the floor tomorrow to do just that, and continue to follow through on our commitment to America to address those problems facing hardworking families. With that, be happy to take any questions.